35,000 francs. That was the price of a child's life. In the crowded hallway of a national hospital, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and walls stained with time, a barefoot mother clutched her baby girl, just 6 months old, barely breathing, lips pale, skin cold. She screamed, loud enough to echo through the sterile halls, loud enough to silence even the nurses. But no one came. No one moved. No money, no treatment, they said, as if a price tag could measure a heartbeat. Then a man stopped. He wasn't wearing a suit or a presidential sash. No bodyguards pushing through the crowd. Just quiet eyes and a stillness that cut through the noise. President Ibrahim Traoré was only there to visit a friend. But what he saw that day would change everything. And what he did next would bring a nation to tears. Before we begin, a small note. While this story may be fictionalized in parts, the emotions are very real, drawn from the countless unheard cries of injustice, from mothers across the world who've been told they are too poor to deserve help. This is not just a story. It is a reflection of what we ignore and what we must become. The heat in Ouagadougou that morning clung to everything, to car windows, to sidewalks, to the shirts of workers rushing between traffic. The sun wasn't just shining, it was punishing. It beat down on the city like an unforgiving judge. But inside the National Hospital, the air was cold, sterile, almost lifeless. The long corridors hummed with fluorescent lights, their buzzing mixing with the occasional squeak of rubber soles and the low murmur of whispered complaints. The walls, once white, had dulled into a weary yellow. On a peeling bench near the elevator, a child coughed weakly. A nurse passed by without looking. This place, where lives were saved and lost every hour, didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a waiting room between hope and abandonment. And into this quiet decay walked a man who didn't belong. No cameras followed him, no flags, no declarations. Just a tall, dark-skinned figure in a plain gray shirt, simple trousers, and sandals dusted with the red earth of Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré. To the hospital staff, he might have looked like just another visitor. That was exactly what he wanted. He didn't come here as a leader today. He came as a friend. His former military comrade, Captain Douamba, had been recovering from surgery here after an injury on a provincial mission. The president had promised to check in personally. No media, no fanfare, no staged photos for tomorrow's headlines. Just one loyal assistant trailing silently a few steps behind him. But even without his uniform, he carried weight. Nurses glanced up as he passed, their eyes lingering just long enough to wonder, is that really him? But no one dared ask. As he turned the corner into the third-floor surgical wing, the hallway stretched out before him. Long, empty, almost too quiet. The air smelled of antiseptic and something else underneath it. Fatigue. A silence heavy with things left unsaid. He paused, noticing how the lights flickered overhead, casting brief shadows over closed doors and scuffed floor tiles. Something about this place felt wrong. Not violently wrong, quietly wrong, systemically wrong. The kind of wrong you only feel if you know what right is supposed to look like. And Ibrahim Traoré knew. He'd grown up in these same streets, had once been a child in a rural clinic just like this. Back when his mother couldn't afford medicine for his fever. Back when doctors didn't listen unless you had clean shoes. He knew what it was like to be invisible. But now, paradoxically, as the head of a nation, he was also learning what it meant to be seen too much. Surrounded by formalities, protocol, bureaucracy. Today, he wanted none of it. He gently opened the door to Douamba's room. His friend was asleep, IV in his arm, steady beeping on the monitor. The president nodded softly, a half-smile forming as he turned to his assistant. We'll let him rest. We'll come back later. And just as he stepped back into the corridor, a sound, not a sound, a rupture, a scream, raw, unfiltered, piercing through linoleum walls and protocol, a woman's voice, wailing, not polite, not controlled, not the kind of sound you expect to hear in the presence of power. Traoré froze. So did his assistant. Down the hallway, a young woman stumbled into view. Barefoot, trembling, her dress torn at the hem, her arms wrapped around something small and bundled in a pink cloth. Her voice cracked from desperation as she shouted, "Please, please someone help! My baby! She's dying! Don't let her die!" Nurses peeked out from doors. A doctor paused mid-step. People turned, watched, but nobody moved. Ibrahim's chest tightened. His hand instinctively rose, not to signal his guard, but to still the assistant, who looked ready to intervene. "Let her speak," he whispered. In that moment, the president standing still while the woman rushed forward with the weight of her world dying in her arms, was the first crack in the wall between power and people. The hallway held its breath, because the most powerful man in the country was no longer looking for a friend's hospital bed. He was staring at a test far greater, and none of them, not even the president, knew what would happen next. The scream came without warning, not a cry, not a call for help, but a piercing, ragged wail, so raw it sliced through the stillness of the hospital like shattered glass. It rose from somewhere deep, deeper than pain, deeper than fear. It was the sound of a soul unraveling. President Ibrahim Traoré stopped mid-step. So did the assistant behind him. For a few seconds, time seemed to stretch, as if the hallway itself held its breath. Then she appeared. She wasn't walking. She was stumbling, half dragging her feet, one sandal missing, the other barely clinging to her heel. Her dress, once red, had faded into a dusty brown, frayed at the edges and soaked with sweat. Her hair clung to her forehead in messy, wet strands. In her arms, clutched tightly against her chest, was a small bundle of pink fabric, torn, thin, and shaking slightly. No, not shaking, shivering, weakly, almost imperceptibly. The woman's name, though no one had asked yet, was Salamata. Her baby's name was Miriam, only 6 months old, and she was dying. Salamata's eyes were bloodshot, swollen from hours of crying. Her face was streaked with dust and desperation. Her arms trembled under the weight of her child, not because the child was heavy, but because the moment was. Because no mother is ever prepared to carry her baby this way. Not to a crib, not to a cradle, but to the edge of goodbye. "Please," she screamed again, her voice breaking as she fell to her knees in the middle of the hallway. "Please, someone help us. She can't breathe. My baby's dying. Please don't let her die." Doors creaked open. Faces peeked out. A nurse leaned against a wall, arms crossed. A doctor turned the corner, saw her, paused, and kept walking. Salimata looked around frantically, hoping someone would come running, hoping someone would kneel beside her, hoping someone would see her as more than an interruption. But no one moved. No one helped. No one even knelt. One nurse murmured something to another. "They told her already. No money, no treatment." Another replied, "Protocol. It's not our call." Salimata heard them, every word, but she kept begging. "I don't have anything, please. My husband, he died 2 weeks ago. I have no one left. I walked for hours to get here. They said it was the only place that could help her. Please, please." Her baby coughed once, a dry, thin gas that sounded like the last flicker of a candle about to go out. That was when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask permission. He didn't care about being off duty. He moved like someone who'd just seen something that broke whatever barrier he still had between leader and human. He knelt down slowly in front of the woman, his gray shirt grazing the floor, his eyes focused only on the baby in her arms. The child's lips were turning pale blue. Her fingers curled weakly, then fell still. "What's her name?" Ibrahim asked softly. Salimata blinked, almost too shocked to answer. Miriam," she whispered. "Please, sir, she's all I have." He looked around. His voice, when it came, was low, controlled, dangerous. "Where is the nurse on duty?" he asked. No one answered. "Where is the doctor in charge of emergencies?" Still silence. He turned to his assistant. "Get the hospital director, now." The assistant hesitated only for a second before sprinting down the hall. Ibrahim turned back to the woman. His voice softened again. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. Salimata shook her head, her eyes hollow. "No, I didn't. I have no money. They won't help me. I was going to go back home and just hold her until—" Her voice cracked. She couldn't finish. Ibrahim Traoré looked down at the baby again. Her tiny chest barely moved. Then he looked up, at the hallway full of staff, of people who had watched without stepping forward, people who had followed the rules but abandoned the heart of medicine. And in that moment, something in him hardened. Because he knew this wasn't just about one baby. It was about a system that had turned protocol into a death sentence. And he would not let it happen again. Not today. Salimata's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed at President Traoré's feet. Not out of protocol, not out of fear, but from pure exhaustion. Her arms tightened around the tiny, unmoving body of her daughter, as if she could somehow press life back into her. Her forehead touched the cold hospital floor as her voice dropped to a whisper. Please, please help her. My husband died 2 weeks ago in a car crash. He was a driver. We had nothing but each other. I haven't eaten since yesterday. I walked here at sunrise. I thought this hospital could help. Her words came out in fragments, caught between gasps for air and the aching silence that followed. She got sick last night. I don't know what's wrong. Fever, breathing. She just kept getting colder. They said I needed to pay 35,000 francs before they even look at her. I begged. I offered to leave my ID, my clothes, anything. But they said, no money, no treatment. 35,000 CFA, just over $50. That was the cost of time, of oxygen, of a child's chance at life. That was the price of mercy withheld. President Traoré stared at her, not as a politician calculating next steps, not as a figure of power deciding what image this would project, but as a man whose own mother had once walked through a rural clinic with nothing but hope in her hands. Something deep inside him, buried beneath years of office walls, diplomatic handshakes, military briefings, shifted, cracked, came alive. He turned slightly, leaned in toward his assistant, and whispered with steel in his voice, "Call the hospital director. Tell him the president is here, now." The assistant hesitated for less than a second, just long enough to process the gravity of the moment, then disappeared down the corridor at a sprint. Ibrahim lowered himself gently to one knee. He wasn't thinking about cameras. There were none. He wasn't thinking about headlines. There would be no reporters here today. He was thinking only of the child. Her name was Mariam, and Mariam was turning cold in her mother's arms because a system built to save lives had been trained to ask for money first. He looked around slowly. Staff had started to gather, quiet and cautious. Some nurses kept their distance, eyes wide. A few doctors shifted uneasily behind their clipboards, avoiding his gaze. The hallway that had once been indifferent was now brimming with silent witnesses. Traoré reached out and gently touched Mariam's cheek. It was damp, but the heat was gone. A frightening stillness had replaced it. His jaw tightened. Not in anger, but in decision. Whatever title he carried didn't matter now. Not here. Not when a child's life was unraveling in front of him. He stood up, eyes scanning the hallway, and said louder now to everyone within earshot, "Is this how we treat the poor in Burkina Faso? Is this how we value our children?" The silence that followed was louder than any answer. No one dared to respond, and in that silence, something transformed within him. He was no longer just a president walking through a broken system. He had become part of it. He was the father of a nation that had learned to look away. And now, he would no longer look away. The sound of footsteps pounding against tile broke the tension, like thunder rolling through a silent valley. From the far end of the hallway, the hospital director appeared, half running, half tripping over his own urgency. His face was pale, his forehead already beaded with sweat. He had been told only one thing: the president is here, and he is not happy. Behind him, a wave of nurses and doctors began to form. A sudden flurry of white coats, gloved hands, and clipboards hastily abandoned. The frozen corridor came alive in an instant, transformed by a single presence. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for pleasantries. He pointed at the child in Salimata's arms. "Take her. Now treat her like she is my daughter, because today she is." No one questioned him. Two nurses rushed forward with practiced, urgent hands. One gently took the bundle from Salimata's arms, while the other motioned for a stretcher. A third pulled a walkie-talkie from her pocket and barked into it, Code red. Pediatric emergency. Prepare ER. Stat Salimata stood frozen for a moment, her arms empty, her body trembling. The sudden absence of weight in her chest felt like a wound. She reached forward as if to pull Miriam back, but a hand stopped her. Warm, firm. Ibrahim. Let them help her, he said gently. She's in good hands now. Tears poured down her face, lips quivering. Is she going to live? He didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the stretcher as it disappeared through the swinging doors at the end of the hallway. Then he looked back at Salimata, not with the practiced calm of a politician, but with the quiet resolve of a man who has made a promise to the universe. She will, he said. She must. Inside the emergency room, the pace was a controlled storm. Baby Miriam was placed on a small pediatric bed, surrounded by machines that blinked and beeped. A nurse adjusted an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. Another pierced her tiny arm with an IV, threading in life drop by drop. A young doctor in his 20s, his name tag read, Doctor. Jules Ouedraogo stood at the foot of the bed, issuing orders quickly. Oxygen stable. Blood pressure low. We need a full panel. CBC, infection markers, malaria screen. Go. One nurse drew blood with careful precision. Another unwrapped clean linens, replacing the soiled cloth Miriam had been wrapped in. The baby's skin was pale, but under the bright light, her chest moved, shallow but consistent. It was the first thing Dr. Jules noticed. She's still fighting, he murmured. This little one, she's not giving up. Outside the emergency doors, Salimata stood hunched, hugging herself. Her body shook from exhaustion, fear, and the adrenaline that still surged through her veins. She looked smaller than before, folded in on herself, as if afraid to hope. President Traoré remained beside her, arms crossed, watching every movement through the observation glass. His jaw clenched, not in anger anymore, but in something deeper, resolve perhaps, or sorrow too long ignored. He turned to his assistant, who had just returned from updating the hospital guards. His voice was low but firm. Go to the market. Get baby clothes, diapers, formula. Everything a newborn needs for 3 months. The assistant blinked. All of that, sir? Yes. And get her a proper wrap. Not this rag. She's family now. The assistant nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Inside the ER, Dr. Jules checked the monitor again, then looked toward the observation window. He didn't wave. He just gave a small, tired nod. Hope, but cautious, uncertain, fragile. Salimata noticed. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto Ibrahim's. You don't even know me, she whispered. Why are you doing this? He didn't smile. He simply answered. Because you cried, and too many like you cry alone. They stood there, just a mother and a man, watching a child fight for breath behind a pane of glass. And in that quiet moment, something began to shift, not just in the hospital, but in a city, in a country, in the soul of a people used to being unheard. Miriam wasn't safe yet, but she had a chance. And sometimes, a chance is everything. The hallway had gone quiet again, but not with peace, rather with pressure. A silence thick with fear, guilt, and anticipation. It was the kind of quiet that settles before a storm fully breaks, before words become orders and hesitation becomes consequence. President Ibrahim Traoré paced slowly just outside the emergency room, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the narrow glass window where a tiny figure lay under the glare of surgical lights. His shoes made a soft, steady sound on the floor. Tap, 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 rhythmic, controlled. But underneath that control, a fire smoldered. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Fury, when wrapped in composure, becomes something far more powerful, something unignorable. The hospital director finally arrived, breathless, face flushed, sweat darkening the collar of his neatly ironed shirt. He rushed forward, visibly shaken, his voice uneven. Your Excellency, I didn't know you were here. No one informed me. Had we known? Ibrahim turned toward him slowly, his expression unreadable. You didn't need to know I was here, he said, voice low and level. You only needed to know that a child was dying on your floor. The director stammered, tried to regain footing. It's, it's hospital protocol, sir. Emergency care requires a deposit, especially for non-registered patients. We, stop, Ibrahim cut in, his tone suddenly sharp, slicing through the man's justifications like a blade through paper. The hallway seemed to shrink around them. He stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to ensure every word was heard, remembered. Let me be clear, he said, voice as cold as polished steel. From this day forward, no patient in emergency, none, shall be denied treatment because of money. Not in this hospital, not in any hospital in Burkina Faso. The director swallowed, eyes darting to the glass behind Ibrahim, where Mariam's tiny body still lay, hooked to monitors. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Save the agreement, Ibrahim replied. Show me with your policies, with your actions, not your words. He turned away. The conversation finished, even if the directive had only just begun. Inside the ER, the room was still in motion. Machines beeped in steady rhythm. A nurse adjusted the oxygen tube as another gently massaged Miriam's hand to stimulate circulation. Her tiny chest rose and fell now, barely but consistently. Dr. Jules stood by her side, watching the monitor. Her vitals are stabilizing, he muttered to himself, cautiously optimistic. Still critical, but she's holding. One of the nurses leaned in. Do we have results from the blood panel? Not yet, Jules replied, but she's responding to fluids. That's something. Outside, Salimata hadn't moved far. She stood pressed against the wall, fingers intertwined so tightly they'd turn white. Every beep, every muffled voice from behind the glass made her flinch. Her eyes flicked between her child and the man beside her, the president, who was now pacing again, but slower, deeper in thought. He wasn't just thinking about Miriam now. He was thinking about how many other mothers had been turned away, how many children never even made it through these doors, how many cries had echoed in these hallways and gone unanswered. His fists clenched without realizing it, not because he felt helpless, but because he finally understood how the system had become comfortable with looking away. That comfort ended today. He walked over to Salimata again, his voice softer now. She's not out of danger, he said, but she's fighting, and so are we. Salimata didn't answer. She couldn't, but her body sagged slightly, something inside her easing just a little, enough to breathe again. And somewhere, behind all the noise, behind the policy, behind the fear, a quiet revolution had begun. No declarations, no protests, no headlines, just a shift, one heartbeat at a time. Outside the emergency room, the noise had settled into something softer, machines humming, footsteps receding, the occasional distant cough. In this pocket of quiet, President Ibrahim Traoré stood beside Salimata as she stared at the glass that separated her from her child. Her eyes were tired, swollen, but now not empty. He studied her for a moment, not as a politician sizing up a story, but as a man trying to understand a woman who had walked through fire with nothing but hope wrapped in a torn piece of cloth. What's your name? He asked quietly. She turned to him slowly, surprised by the softness in his voice. Salimata, she whispered. Salimata Kone. And Miriam is your only child? She nodded. Your husband? He asked gently. She looked down, twisting the edge of her sleeve. He was a driver. Good man, honest. He died 2 weeks ago, a truck accident on the northern road. He was on night shift. Ibrahim's eyes narrowed slightly. The northern routes were known for poor lighting, no safety rails, another flaw in the system that cost lives in silence. And now, he asked? She shook her head. No family here. I came to the city with him. Since he died, I've been staying with a neighbor, but she has children of her own. I tried looking for work, cleaning, cooking, but no one wants a woman with a crying baby on her back. She stopped, as if embarrassed, as if she'd said too much. But Ibrahim didn't look away. He listened. All of it. He looked through the glass again. Miriam still lay under careful watch, her chest moving steadily now, the oxygen mask misting softly with each breath. Her arms twitched slightly. Alive. Still fragile, but alive. He turned back to Salimata. You've suffered enough, he said simply. Today that ends. She blinked. What do you mean? I'm arranging a house for you. A small one. Nothing grand, but yours. Somewhere you can sleep without fear. And you'll have a job. Receptionist work at a local government office. Part-time at first, until Mariam is strong. Salimata's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard correctly, if perhaps exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. You're giving me a job, she whispered. He nodded. You need dignity, not just sympathy. A mother shouldn't have to choose between feeding her child and bearing her. She broke. Tears spilled from her again, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from the sudden weight of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. I don't know what to say, she choked out. Don't say anything, Ibrahim replied. Just stay standing. A soft knock on the glass interrupted them. One of the nurses pointed toward Mariam, then gave a small smile. The baby had opened her eyes, only slightly, but it was enough. Enough to see light, enough to remind them she was still here. Salimata pressed her hands against the glass, breath catching in her throat. Ibrahim took a slow step forward, watching the small figure on the hospital bed shift gently, blink once, and twitch her fingers like she was trying to reach the world again. His chest tightened, and before he could stop it, moisture welled in his own eyes. He turned his head slightly, swallowing hard, and then, almost to himself, he whispered the words that had been building quietly inside him since the moment he saw Salimata kneeling on that floor. This is why I lead. For her. For you. Not for the speeches, not for the flags, not for power, but for this. A child breathing, a mother standing, and a future beginning again. Right here, in the hallway where everything almost ended. It wasn't planned. No press conference, no statement, no red carpet rolled out to mark a presidential visit. In fact, no one in the media even knew President Ibrahim Traoré had stepped into the National Hospital that morning. But sometimes the most powerful stories don't need planning, just presence. And someone, no one is sure exactly who, caught it. The image wasn't staged, it wasn't even sharp. It was slightly tilted, as if taken in a rush. The lighting was uneven, the hospital hallway in the background dull and flickering. But what it captured didn't need perfection. It showed a president in a simple gray shirt, crouched beside a barefoot woman whose face was soaked in tears. One of his hands gently held hers. Behind them, blurred but unmistakable through the glass of the ER, was a tiny baby wrapped in fresh hospital linen, surrounded by beeping machines. The caption was brief. President Ibrahim holds the hand of a mother begging for her baby's life. Within hours, the photo was everywhere. It exploded on local news blogs, then national dailies. By evening, it had spread across Francophone Africa. By morning, it was the most shared image on social media in Burkina Faso, retweeted by students, reposted by market vendors, whispered about in mosques and churches. Something about it cut deep. Maybe it was the contrast, the image of power kneeling beside poverty. Maybe it was the vulnerability, the way the president wasn't speaking, commanding, or performing. He was simply there, listening. Or maybe it was the timing. A country tired of hearing promises, watching corruption scandals, seeing leaders distance themselves from the struggles of ordinary citizens. And now, suddenly, here was a moment that felt different. Human, immediate, real. Headlines followed quickly. A leader who listens. The president who paused everything for a dying child. Burkina Faso sees compassion in power. Even people who usually scrolled past political news stopped. One woman in Bobo Dioulasso commented under the post, "I've never cried watching the news until today." A student in Kédougou posted, "My uncle died last year because they asked for money before giving him oxygen. This photo gives me hope that someone finally understands." A nurse in Tenkodogo wrote anonymously, "I've had to turn away mothers like her before. I still see their faces at night. Maybe this changes now." It wasn't just about the president. It became a mirror. For citizens, for health workers, for officials. A moment of quiet reckoning. In one classroom, a teacher printed out the image and taped it to the blackboard. She asked her students, "What do you see here?" A child raised her hand and answered, "I see a man who didn't pretend not to hear." Even late-night radio hosts, known more for music and jokes, began opening their shows by discussing the photo. Callers phoned in, not just to praise the president, but to share their own stories. Times they were turned away. Times they saw someone suffer because help had a price tag. And in the presidential villa, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his study as his aide brought in the latest stack of printed newspapers. He didn't say much. He just looked at the image again. He remembered that moment clearly, the sound of Salamata's voice breaking, the way her hands trembled when he held them, the terrifying stillness of baby Miriam's chest, and the unbearable truth that if he hadn't been there, if he hadn't heard, Miriam might not be alive. He didn't care for headlines, but he cared that people were talking, not just about him, but about the system, about the injustice of it all. He knew the real test wasn't whether people liked the photo, it was whether they would act because of it. That night, Salimata had no idea her face was on every screen in the country. She was asleep in a chair beside her daughter's bed, one hand resting on the edge of the hospital crib. Her head tilted forward, breathing slow and steady. And baby Miriam opened her eyes again. No hashtags, no trending charts. Just a baby girl, alive, and a country beginning to remember what compassion looked like. The photo had done its job. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse, but it awakened. In hospitals from Wahiguya to Benfora, nurses who had once recited deposit policies without blinking now found themselves pausing. Pausing before they turned away a desperate mother. Pausing before they repeated that line, "No money, no treatment." It no longer sounded like protocol. It sounded like cruelty. One young nurse in Toma, Aminata, stood before a teenage boy who had brought in his younger sister, unconscious from fever. She asked about payment out of habit, but then remembered the image, the child's eyes, the president's hands. She waved the boy through and whispered, "Take her in. We'll figure it out later." Across the country, murmurs turned into movement. WhatsApp groups of medical workers buzzed with quiet conversations. "Did you see the clip on RTB? Ibrahim was in a hospital without any press? He ordered immediate treatment, no deposit. Do you think they'll change the law?" In dusty government buildings where fans clicked lazily overhead and paperwork piled up like sand dunes, ministers began to feel something unfamiliar. Pressure, not the usual political noise. This was different. This came from the street, from their staff, from their own families. At a regional health meeting in Kudugu, the Minister of Health, long accused of ignoring frontline workers, found himself facing questions not from journalists, but from his own district officers. "Sir, if the president believes money should never stop emergency care, should we not update the protocol immediately?" At first, there was defensiveness. We must be careful. Resources are limited. Systems take time. But systems had already been shaken. In the presidential villa, Ibrahim Traoré knew what came next. Emotion was not enough. Headlines faded. Compassion, no matter how powerful, would be wasted without structure, without law. He summoned his legal advisors, health ministry representatives, and senior aides into a quiet, private meeting. No cameras, no sound bites. The room filled with tension, not fear, but anticipation. Everyone had seen the photo. Everyone knew the president's tone had shifted since that day. There was a sense that this wasn't just another decree, it would be a line in the sand. Ibrahim didn't waste time. "We cannot govern with silence," he said. "That child, Miriam, will not become a symbol that fades in a news cycle. She will be a reason, a starting point." He turned to the Minister of Health. "We will draft a directive today, clear, uncompromising. From now on, every hospital in Burkina Faso must treat emergency cases first. Payment can wait. No family should lose a loved one because they are poor." There were no objections. Later that week, the directive was signed, sealed, and distributed, printed on government letterhead, bearing the presidential crest, and translated into 5 major local languages. It was simple. Emergency care first, payment later, no exceptions. Copies were posted in every public hospital, clinic, and health post. Nurses taped them beside intake desks. Doctors read them aloud during morning briefings. Patients pointed to them when asked about deposits. For the first time, the word policy didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like protection. In Bobo Dioulasso, an older doctor who'd served during 3 regimes, leaned back in his chair after reading the notice and muttered to his colleague, "Maybe this time, it's not just talk." The directive didn't solve everything. Medicine still ran short. Beds were still limited. But something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer acceptable to ignore a dying child. No longer acceptable to hide behind paperwork. No longer acceptable to say no just because someone was poor. A sleeping system had stirred, and though it was only the beginning, it was real, and it was moving. The sun was beginning to set when the small white van pulled up in front of a modest 2-room apartment on the edge of the city. The building wasn't new, but it was clean, freshly painted, with iron bars on the windows and a flowering hibiscus bush just outside the door. The scent of evening dust mixed with the sweetness of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. Salimata stepped out of the van slowly, Miriam swaddled against her chest. She blinked as if she were still dreaming. A woman from the Ministry of Social Affairs handed her a single key attached to a blue ribbon. "It's yours," the woman said, smiling. "Welcome home." Salimata didn't answer. Her lips trembled. Her hands gripped the baby tighter, not from fear, but from the fragile disbelief that any of this was real. Inside, the apartment was simple but whole. A small bed stood in one corner, neatly made with clean sheets. A plastic wardrobe held a few pieces of clothing and diapers. The kitchenette had a gas stove, a pot, 2 bowls, a bag of rice. In the other room, there was a mat, a fan, a tiny bathroom with running water. It wasn't much by most standards, but for Salimata, who had spent nights sleeping on tiled hospital floors, sharing stale bread with strangers, and wondering whether her child would live to see another sunrise, this was paradise. She laid Miriam on the bed and sat beside her, watching the baby sleep. The child's breath now steady, her fingers curled gently around the corner of a pillow, her skin no longer pale. Salimata exhaled, slowly, deeply, as if for the first time in weeks. Her back straightened, her hands relaxed, her eyes softened. That night she didn't cry. She just watched. Watched the room, watched the walls, watched the little shadows move gently across the floor. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted in through the window, children laughing somewhere nearby, a radio playing a distant love song, the familiar clatter of pots from another kitchen. This was what safety sounded like. As she sat there, the baby still sleeping beside her, a soft knock came at the door. She hesitated, then rose and opened it. A young woman stood outside with a notepad and a badge clipped to her dress. She smiled. "Good evening. I'm from the National Women's Association. We were sent by the President's office. We're offering support for single mothers, training programs, access to child care, and microloans if you want to start a small business." Salimata stared at her. "You want to help me?" The woman nodded. "Yes, we're building something, and you're part of it now." She handed her a small leaflet and wrote her name down on the registry. Salimata signed with a shaky hand. She didn't have a plan, didn't know what kind of business, or if she could even learn something new. But for the first time, someone believed she could. As the woman left, Salimata stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the quiet street. She wasn't invisible anymore. She turned back into the house, picked up Miriam, and held her close. The baby stirred, blinked once, then settled again. "We have a home now," she whispered into the child's ear, "and a beginning." Outside, the wind stirred the hibiscus flowers gently, as if nodding in agreement. It was a Tuesday morning when Salimata returned to the hospital, the same one where she had once collapsed on the cold floor, clutching her daughter's lifeless body and begging strangers to see her as more than a burden. But today she was standing tall. Her dress was clean, her scarf neatly tied. In her arms, baby Miriam blinked up at the world, healthier, heavier, her cheeks round and warm with life. Salimata had no appointment, no reason really, no requirement to return. But in her heart, she knew she couldn't move forward without first going back. She walked through the same entrance she had once entered in tears. The security guard recognized her immediately and stepped aside with a respectful nod. She smiled, whispered a soft, "Thank you," and continued down the corridor that had once witnessed her worst moment. The hallway had not changed. Same yellowing walls, same flickering lights. But for Salimata, the air felt different now. It didn't press down on her like it once had. It opened around her, as if letting her pass. She reached the pediatric wing and stopped at the nurse's desk. A young nurse looked up and froze, eyes widening in recognition. "Mariam," the nurse whispered, almost involuntarily. "That's her?" Salimata nodded. The nurse stood quickly, walked around the desk, and reached out to gently touch the baby's foot. "She's beautiful. She looks so strong." Another nurse emerged from the back, followed by Dr. Jewel. All of them paused at the sight. It wasn't just that they remembered the case. They remembered the fear, the urgency, the moment they thought the child might not make it. Now Mariam was awake and calm in her mother's arms, grabbing at the collar of Salimata's blouse with her tiny fingers, making soft, curious noises. A third nurse stepped forward and handed Salimata a small paper bag. "Some vitamins and a few extra bottles of antibiotics. They're not on record, but we wanted to make sure you had what you needed." Salimata accepted the bag with both hands, tears forming again. But these were different. These were the kind that swell in your throat when someone gives, without expecting anything in return. Another nurse leaned closer and whispered, "She's a miracle child. We still talk about her. We thought we'd lose her. We really did." Salimata looked at each of them in turn, her voice steady but soft. "You didn't just save her," she said. "You saved me." They all fell silent. Some smiled. One nurse blinked quickly and turned away, pretending to check a clipboard. Even Dr. Jules cleared his throat and looked at the floor for a second longer than necessary. "I came back," Salimata continued, "because I didn't get to say thank you. That day, everything happened so fast, and I was too afraid, too empty, to feel anything but fear." Dr. Jules finally met her gaze. "You don't have to thank us." Salimata shook her head gently. "Yes, I do. Because you listened. Because when one man made a choice, all of you followed it with action. That changed everything." She turned to the youngest nurse and handed her a folded piece of cloth, an old wrap, faded pink, the same one she had used to carry Mariam the day they first arrived. "This is the cloth she was wrapped in. It's clean now. I don't need it anymore. But I want you to keep it here, as a reminder, not of pain, but of hope." The nurse took it carefully, as if holding something sacred. As Salimata turned to leave, a small group of patients watched her walk down the corridor. Some whispered. One woman smiled. Another reached out and touched her arm gently as she passed, murmuring, "God bless your baby." Back outside, the sun was high, the air warm. Salimata breathed it in deeply. Mariam stirred again in her arms, looked up at her, and gave the tiniest of grins. Salimata smiled back, pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, and whispered, "We're not just surviving anymore, my love. We're living." Night had long since fallen over Ouagadougou, but inside the president's private study, the lamp still burned. The curtains were drawn. The room was quiet, except for the occasional scratch of pen against paper and the low whir of the ceiling fan slicing the heat into ribbons of still air. There was no music, no news, no conversation, only a silence so dense it felt sacred. Ibrahim Traoré sat alone at his desk, sleeves rolled up, collar open, fatigue visible in the lines beneath his eyes. But he wasn't resting. Before him was a thick folder, overstuffed and dog-eared, marked in bold letters, "Hospital Incident Reports, Public Sector." He had asked for it personally, not summaries, not filtered data, the real reports. Every file, every memo, every complaint. He wanted to see them all. Page after page revealed the same grim pattern: cases of patients turned away, emergencies delayed, children who died en route to clinics because their parents couldn't pay an entry fee. There were testimonies from nurses forced to say no, doctors who wrote apologies in the margins of death certificates, families who never returned to collect their files. Ibrahim's pen moved slowly across each page, circling names, underlining phrases in red ink. At the top of one report, dated just 6 months earlier, he scrawled a single line in capital letters: "Health is a right, not a privilege." The words bled into the paper, firm and final. He turned the page. Another story. A boy of 8. malaria, rejected due to unpaid school fees affecting the family's eligibility for subsidized care. Dead on arrival, circle, red line. Another annotation, systemic failure. Policy review needed. His eyes moved quickly, but his heart didn't. He felt every case like a weight added to his chest. Each file a name. Each name a world lost. A soft knock came at the door. His assistant, young and loyal, entered with hesitation. He held a fresh folder, new complaints collected just that week, but paused when he saw the president's face. "Sir," the assistant said gently, "it's past midnight." Ibrahim looked up, eyes bloodshot but focused. "Leave it," he said, nodding toward the folder. The assistant placed it on the desk but didn't move. "Sir," he began carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he used for official statements. "You're carrying too much. No one expects one man to fix an entire system overnight." Ibrahim sat back slightly, rubbing the bridge of his nose, then exhaled. Not from defeat, but from the sheer weight of what still needed to be done. "Then let others carry it too," he said quietly, "but I won't stop." His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. But inside that weariness was something unbreakable. "I didn't come here to sit in meetings and give speeches," he continued. "I came here to serve. If a child dies because of a form or a fee, that's on all of us, especially me." The assistant nodded, but his silence carried worry. "The ministers won't all agree with this pace, sir." "They don't have to," Ibrahim replied, picking up his pen again. "They only have to move." He flipped the next report open and began reading. The assistant stood there for a moment longer, unsure if he should leave, speak, or simply say thank you. In the end, he just turned and closed the door softly behind him. Back at the desk, the red pen continued its work. Another name, another circle, another child whose life ended too soon. And though the city outside slept, the man at the center of it, burdened, unyielding, refused to. Because this wasn't politics anymore. This was personal. It started with a conversation under a mango tree. 3 young women in Bobo Dioulasso, seated on plastic chairs outside a neighborhood pharmacy, passed around a torn newspaper with Salimata's photo on the front page. One of them had circled the headline with a pen, "She cried and the nation heard." They had all read the story, how a poor mother nearly lost her child because she couldn't afford emergency care, and how the president himself had changed a policy because of her tears. But what stayed with them wasn't the president's power, it was the mother's voice. "She cried out loud," said Awa, a nursing student, and for once someone actually listened. "She was alone," another added, "but not anymore." By the end of that week, they had formed a group, not official, not even structured. Just a few young women collecting stories, sharing resources, and visiting clinics in the area. They called themselves Voices of the Mothers. The name spread quickly. Within days, others joined. University students, midwives, teachers, even young doctors frustrated with the barriers their patients faced. They didn't wear uniforms or carry banners. They came with notebooks, care packages, and quiet determination. Their mission was simple: find struggling mothers, listen to them, help where they could, and most importantly, speak up when the system stayed silent. The first formal chapter of Voices of the Mothers launched at a community center in Bobo Dioulasso just 2 weeks later. They organized health workshops, fundraisers for emergency care, and small group counseling for women who had lost children due to medical negligence or poverty. It wasn't grand, but it was real. One volunteer printed Salamata's story on flyers, handing them out at clinics with the words, "This is not just her story, it could have been yours. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again." The impact began to ripple outward. Clinic staff who had once enforced deposit policies without question now found themselves being gently challenged. "Would you have said the same thing if the president were watching?" One volunteer asked a receptionist who had turned away a pregnant teenager, and in some cases, the system responded. Nurses began keeping small emergency funds in locked drawers, donated by local businesses or church groups. A young pediatrician in Kudugu began hosting weekend checkups free of charge, inspired by what he called a mother's courage that rewrote a law. It wasn't just medical professionals who took notice. Local officials, community elders, and even regional journalists began covering the movement. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was persistent. It didn't scream in the streets. It moved quietly, like the pain it tried to heal. Back in Ouagadougou, a short clip circulated online. A group of young mothers in matching head wraps walking into a rural clinic carrying boxes of diapers and medicine. The caption read, "From victims to voices, from silence to strength." One morning, President Ibrahim received a sealed envelope at his office. Inside was a handwritten note. "We are the daughters of Salimata. You started the change. Now let us carry it. You are not alone." Voices of the Mothers, Chapter 01. He placed the letter beside a familiar item on his desk, a small, faded baby sock, and for the first time in days he allowed himself a smile, because compassion had done more than move hearts. It had moved people, and now those people were moving the country. Every morning Salimata woke before the sun, not out of habit or necessity, but from something quieter, gratitude. She would rise carefully so as not to wake Miriam, who now slept soundly in her own small bed beside her mother's. The apartment, once echoing with uncertainty, now hummed with rhythm. There was a routine, a pulse to the day. She'd wash, dress in her neatly pressed uniform, a pale blue blouse and a knee-length skirt, and feed her daughter before carrying her to the nearby creche run by the Women's Association. Then, she'd walk the 6 blocks to the small government office where her life had turned its next page. Salimata was now a receptionist at the Ministry of Local Services. It was a modest job in a modest building. Her desk sat near the entrance, facing a wall decorated with a national flag and a framed portrait of President Ibrahim. But no one walked into that building without noticing her first. From the very beginning, people took to her, not because she was loud or particularly clever, but because she greeted every visitor like someone who mattered. Her voice was soft, her tone calm. When handing out forms or pointing to offices, she always ended with 2 words spoken not out of politeness, but truth. "Thank you." And somehow, it never sounded routine. Her colleagues were quick to notice. "She never raises her voice," one clerk remarked, "even when the queue is long or someone complains." "She treats people like guests, not problems," said another. Even the grumpiest inspectors who stomped through the doors expecting delays or excuses found themselves pausing when she smiled at them. "Good morning, sir." "Yes, ma'am, just fill this. The office is upstairs, last door on the left. Thank you for coming." Some would smile back. Some would say nothing. But they remembered her. What they didn't see was what happened each time Salimata received her paycheck. She didn't rush to spend it. She didn't count it in public. Instead, she took it home, laid it gently in a small tin box beside Miriam's birth certificate, and whispered, "Another prayer answered." Because for Salimata, money was never just money. It was food that no longer had to be begged for. It was medicine bought before fevers became crises. It was rent paid without fear of being turned out at night. It was a future slowly unfolding in the shape of dignity. Sometimes after work, she would sit under the neem tree near her building, watching Miriam nap in her lap. Other mothers would join her. They laughed, gossiped, shared tips on where to find cheap soap or good mangoes. But now when one of them spoke of struggling, it was Salimata who reached into her small bag and quietly slipped them a coin or a name to call for help. "You work for the government now," one woman once teased. Salimata smiled. "No," she said, "I work for Miriam." And in truth, she did. Everything she did, from arriving early to clean her own desk, to staying a few minutes late when a confused old man couldn't fill out a form, was not just about duty. It was about never again being invisible. It was about proving that someone like her could belong. In the office, her manager took notice. "She brings calm," he said to a colleague, "and something else, something we don't train for." "Respect?" the colleague asked. "No," the manager replied, "heart." And though few knew her full story, whispers still floated. About a woman whose baby nearly died in the hospital, who cried until the president himself came. Whether people believed it or not, they felt it when they met her, because Salimata didn't wear her past on her sleeve. She wore her hope, every day, without fail. And somehow that hope became contagious. The school courtyard was shaded by a large acacia tree, its branches stretching wide like arms ready to embrace. Beneath it sat nearly 100 girls, cross-legged in neatly pressed uniforms, notebooks on their laps, eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and impatience. They had been told a special guest would speak today, a woman, a mother. Not a politician or a celebrity, but someone who had lived something worth listening to. When Salamata arrived, she wore a simple green dress and a scarf the color of mourning. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need any. The headmistress led her to a makeshift podium, just a wooden table with a chipped edge, and motioned for silence. All of you, she said, will grow into women. Some will lead, some will teach, some will raise children, some will build cities. But before you do, you must hear this woman's story. Salimata stepped forward. She glanced at the sea of young faces before her, some attentive, some fidgeting, one or two whispering quietly, but all watching. My name is Salimata, she began. I am not famous. I don't hold a degree. I didn't come here to impress you. I came because I remember what it feels like to believe that no one sees you, that your voice doesn't matter. The courtyard stilled. A year ago, I had nothing. No home, no job. My baby was dying in my arms. I went to a hospital and was told, no money, no treatment. I begged, I screamed. People passed me by. But I kept crying. I didn't stop. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. And then, someone heard me. A hush fell over the girls. The man who helped me that day was not a doctor. He wasn't there for me. He didn't even know my name. But he saw my pain. And that changed everything. She told him about the moment in the hallway, about baby Mariam barely breathing, about the hand that reached down, not from power, but from empathy. She spoke of the hospital director, the emergency care, the clothes bought for her daughter, the new house, the job, and the second chance she hadn't dared to hope for. Not once did she raise her voice, but every word was a drumbeat in the hearts of the girls listening. Some people will tell you that you must be loud to be heard, that you need titles, followers, or influence. But I'm here to tell you this. Never believe your voice is too small. My cry saved a life and woke a nation. The applause came slowly at first, then grew, rising like a wave. Some girls clapped, others wiped their eyes. A few looked down at their notebooks as if they had just been handed something sacred. When the room quieted again, a small girl in the front row raised her hand shyly. Madam, what do you want Mariam to become when she grows up? Salimata smiled. Kind, she said softly. That's enough. There was silence, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with something unspoken, a reverence for a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not bitter, but bright. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, but none of the girls moved right away. They lingered as if afraid that standing up would break the spell. As Salimata stepped down from the table, a group of girls followed her, asking to shake her hand, to hug her, to tell her they wanted to be like her someday. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, one of them whispered, she's not just a mother, she's a warrior. But Salimata didn't hear that part. She was already walking home, to Mariam, to her second life. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the tall windows of the presidential study, casting long golden streaks across the floor. The room was unusually quiet. No aides, no advisors, no meetings. Just Ibrahim Traoré and the silence that came only when the world outside paused long enough for reflection. He was seated at his desk, sleeves rolled, pen in hand, half lost in a report on rural medical infrastructure. His eyes moved from line to line, but his mind wandered, pulled toward the memory of a hallway, a scream, a child turning pale in her mother's arms. A knock interrupted the stillness. His assistant stepped in, holding a small brown envelope. No stamp, no official seal, just a note scribbled in black ink. To President Ibrahim Traoré. Private. He accepted it wordlessly. As the door closed again, Ibrahim turned the envelope over in his hands. It was light, barely more than paper. He broke the seal and carefully unfolded the contents. Inside was a tiny pink baby sock, soft wear worn, faded around the edges. He turned it over with his fingertips, delicate as if handling something holy. A faint scent of old baby powder clung to the fabric, barely there, like a whisper. Alongside it, a note. She wore this the day you stopped to listen, the day you chose not to walk away. I washed it and kept it all this time, but now I want you to have it, because without you, my daughter would be a memory instead of a miracle. Thank you. From a grateful mother. Ibrahim leaned back in his chair, sock in hand, the letter open beside him. The weight of those few lines landed heavier than any speech he had delivered in Parliament, heavier than any law he had ever signed. He stared at the sock for a long time. It wasn't just fabric, it was evidence of a system once cold, of a scream that cracked through its indifference, of a decision made in a moment that could have been ignored, and of what could happen when a leader didn't look away. He stood slowly, walked to the edge of the room, and stared out the window. Below him, the capital city pulsed with motion, cars honking, children laughing, merchants shouting prices in the street. Life in all its messy brilliance. And yet, in his hand, a reminder. Not all life had a voice loud enough to reach safety. Some still needed someone to listen. He returned to his desk, cleared a space beside his files, and placed the sock there, beside a pen and a framed photo of his late mother. No plaque, no glass case, just a small sock resting on oak, a private monument. Later that evening, during a televised interview, a journalist asked him a simple question. "Mr. President, what keeps you grounded with so much power around you?" Ibrahim hesitated, then answered. "A sock," he said softly. The journalist blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "A baby sock," he repeated. "It reminds me why I'm here, why I can't forget the smallest voice in the loudest room." That night, social media exploded. News outlets replayed the clip. Hashtags spread across the region. Hashtag Sock of Hope. Hashtag One Cry One Nation. Hashtag Traoré listens. But Ibrahim didn't care for virality. He only cared that on his desk sat a silent reminder. That leadership is not measured by how many follow, but by how many you choose to stop for, when no one else will. And somewhere in a modest home across the city, a child named Miriam slept soundly, alive. The studio lights were bright, almost clinical, designed to make everything appear clean, polished, precise. But no amount of lighting could mask what was about to be shared. President Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly on the velvet-lined chair, a small mic clipped to the collar of his white shirt. There was no jacket tonight, no ceremonial sash. Just him, open, focused, present. Across from him sat Amadou Diallo, the most respected journalist in Burkina Faso. Known for his sharp mind and calm tone, Amadou had been preparing for this interview for weeks. The nation was watching. Cafes lowered their volumes. Families sat together on worn couches. In hospitals, waiting rooms played the broadcast. After 40 minutes of structured discussion on healthcare reforms, emergency funding, rural infrastructure, and the future of education, Amadou finally leaned forward and gently shifted the tone. "Mr. President," he said, his voice quieter, more deliberate, "many of our viewers have written in asking about something personal, something that wasn't in any official agenda." Ibrahim looked at him, not startled but cautious. "What really happened that day at the hospital?" The question hung in the air like smoke. For a few seconds, Ibrahim didn't speak. He blinked, looked away from the camera, as if drawing from a place inside that had not yet been exposed. Then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "I didn't go there as the president that day," he said. "I went to visit a friend. Quietly, no entourage, no press." A beat passed, his hands resting calmly on his lap, tightened slightly. And then I heard a scream. He looked directly into the camera. It was the sound of a mother about to lose her child, a cry so raw, it cut through everything, through walls, titles, protocols. He paused again. The silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred. When I saw her, Salamata, on the floor, barefoot, holding that child, I didn't see a stranger. I saw my wife. I saw my mother. I saw every woman in this country who has ever been made to feel invisible. His voice trembled just once. And when I looked at that baby girl, her lips pale, chest barely moving, I saw my daughter. The studio was dead silent. Behind the cameras, a sound technician wiped his eyes. I realized, Ibrahim continued, that power means nothing if it cannot protect the powerless. That day I wasn't a president. I was a father, a citizen, a man. The weight of his words filled the space like a storm gathering, not to destroy, but to cleanse. We talk about policy, he added, but behind every policy is a person, a life, a story. And if we forget that, we forget why we lead. Amadou had no follow-up, none was needed. Back at home in cities and villages across the nation, people sat frozen, some with tears sliding silently down their cheeks. A teacher in Koudougou paused the classroom's video feed and asked her students to write down how they felt. In a small bar in Gawa, hardened men who never showed emotion turned away from their friends to wipe their faces. Ibrahim adjusted his mic as the segment neared its end. "Thank you, Mr. President," Amadou said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Ibrahim replied. "Thank you for asking the question that mattered most." And as the credits rolled, no one reached for the remote, because something real had just happened on national television, and no one wanted to miss the silence that followed. Within 72 hours of the televised interview, the directive was official. Stamped, signed, and distributed from the office of the president, it bore a simple yet forceful title, Emergency Health Reform, Immediate Enforcement. It was not up for debate. Hospitals, clinics, and all registered healthcare facilities across Burkina Faso were to treat all emergency patients immediately, regardless of payment status. Deposit-first policies were now illegal. Life first, paperwork later. Letters were hand-delivered to every provincial governor, district medical chief, and hospital director. Civil monitoring units were formed overnight, comprised of ministry representatives, journalists, and citizens trained to observe, record, and report violations. Ibrahim made it clear, failure to comply would not be overlooked. For years, the walls of bureaucracy had allowed indifference to masquerade as policy. But now the system had a crack, and through it, sunlight poured. In a small town on the edge of the Sahel, Nurse Aminata stood alone outside her clinic, watching the horizon bleed orange as the sun dipped low. She had read the letter that morning, hands trembling as she scanned the bolded sentences. She had followed orders for over a decade. No deposit, no treatment, she'd repeated hundreds of times, sometimes gently, sometimes coldly. It was never her choice, she told herself. It was policy. She was just doing her job. But the letter said something different now. Now the law said compassion was policy. Aminata shifted her weight, listening to the quiet wind move through the trees. The weight of the day clung to her chest, but something deeper pressed harder. Memory, faces, mothers, children, a baby who hadn't cried loud enough. She closed her eyes. "How many lives did we lose because of a deposit?" she whispered. "Not as a nurse, not as an employee, but as a woman, as a witness." The wind didn't answer, but in her chest, something shifted. Not regret. That would come later. What moved now was resolve. The next morning, she pinned the new directive to the clinic's entrance herself. In bold red ink, she underlined the first sentence. "No emergency patient shall be denied care due to inability to pay." Then she sat at her desk and waited. She didn't know who would walk in next, but whoever it was, they would not walk out unseen. The evening breeze was soft and playful, tugging gently at the loose hem of Salamata's wrapped skirt as she sat beneath the neem tree near her new home. The branches above whispered like old women sharing secrets, rustling with the rhythm of a day slowly surrendering to dusk. On her lap, Miriam slept peacefully, her little chest rising and falling with the quiet ease of safety. Her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her mother's scarf, still warm from the sun. Salimata watched the sky turn gold, then amber, then lavender. A small girl from the neighborhood approached, no older than 8, with 2 ribbons in her hair and questions in her eyes. "Is it true the president saved your baby?" she asked, tilting her head. Salimata smiled, eyes never leaving the horizon. "That's what people say." The girl stepped closer. "Did you know it was him?" Salimata shook her head, her voice as soft as the wind. "I didn't see a president that day," she said. "I saw a kind face." The girl was quiet for a moment, then sat beside her, drawing circles in the dirt with a stick. Mama says your daughter's a miracle. Salamata looked down at Miriam, still sleeping, now smiling in her dreams. She almost left me, she whispered, more to the wind than the child. There was a moment I thought I'd lose her forever, but now... She bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead gently. Now I believe she stayed for something great. The sky dimmed, stars quietly appearing one by one, like shy witnesses to the love below. The little girl stood up, brushed dust from her dress, and gave a small wave. I want to be kind like you, she said, before skipping away into the fading light. Salimata leaned back against the tree, closed her eyes for a moment, and breathed deeply. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear in her chest, no noise in her mind, just the warmth of her daughter, the peace of a quiet evening, and the soft, unshakable certainty. That kindness, real, quiet, human kindness, had changed everything. Long past midnight, President Ibrahim Traoré sits alone in his study, a single lamp haloing the pages of his leather-bound journal. He writes one stark sentence across a fresh sheet. A cry in the hallway changed the heart of a nation. Below it he lists hard numbers, new ER admissions, waived deposits, infant survival rates. Yet he knows data will fade if structure does not hold. At dawn he summons the Minister of Health. No speeches, no reporters, only 2 chairs and the quiet weight of purpose. Stories inspire, Ibrahim says, tapping the journal. But systems endure. Build systems, not legends. Let this become policy, not just memory. The minister nods, leaving with a portfolio thicker than when he arrived. Draft bylaws for permanent emergency care funding, a whistleblower hotline, and quarterly audits by citizen groups. Ibrahim closes his journal, sets the baby sock atop it, and breathes out. Resolved but never finished. Months later, a dusty town hall in Kupela overflows with women in bright head wraps. Voices of the mothers, once 3 friends under a mango tree, is now a network spanning every province. Each chapter elects 2 delegates, 1 community elder, 1 young mother, to review clinic practices and report directly to regional health councils. On a hand-painted banner behind the podium is their motto, "One cry woke us, now we are many." Testimonies pour in. A midwife who refused a bribe to skip a poor family in line, a village chief donating land for a free mobile clinic. Policy begins to bend with every gathered story. Maternal care subsidies broaden, ambulance routes expand, deposit fees vanish like old ghosts. At the back of the room, unnoticed at first, sits Ibrahim in plain clothes. He takes no stage, asks no favor, only listens, hands folded, eyes shining, when a speaker says, "That day the president listened to 1 mother. Today the nation listens to thousands." He slips out before applause ends, certain now that leadership shared is leadership sustained. Dawn breaks over a tapestry of small miracles. In a courtyard bathed in soft sun, Miriam totters 3 shaky steps into Salamata's waiting arms. Laughter rings where terror once lived. At a government desk, Salamata, now confident in her crisp blue blouse, smiles as she hands a stamped form to a farmer. "Thank you," she says, and means it. In a rural clinic, a doctor leans over a feverish boy. No parent is asked about money, only about symptoms. A nurse pins the emergency care decree to the wall, like a promise kept. In a primary school art class, crayons dance across paper. A crying mother, a tiny baby, and a tall man crouching to help. The teacher writes on the chalkboard, "Kindness is powerful." Across radio waves and kitchen tables, people repeat a quiet truth. Change did not begin with a law. The law followed a listening heart. Final line. It did not take a law to change the country. It took a leader who listened, and a woman who refused to be silent. True change begins the moment we choose to treat a stranger's pain as our own. President Traoré's response to a single cry reminds us that compassion is not a feeling, but a decision. See, stop, and serve. Systems may seem immovable, yet one courageous act can disrupt an entire chain of indifference and set justice in motion. You don't need a title to lead, only the willingness to let someone else's emergency interrupt your routine. Action. Question: whose silent hallway cry can you hear today And what immediate step will you take to answer it? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.